The wind came down off the ridge like a living thing that November morning, carrying the smell of spruce resin and the promise of serious cold. Marcus Holt stood in the clearing beside his cabin, 40 miles from the nearest town, watching his breath crystallize in the air. He was 53 years old, 28 winters in these mountains, and he knew what the low sun angle and the way the chickadees were frantically caching seeds meant. Hard freeze coming. The kind that tests everything you think you know. He'd been stacking firewood the traditional way for decades. Split rounds piled directly on the ground in long rows, maybe a couple of pallets underneath if you were fancy, covered with tarps weighed down with rocks. It worked, mostly. Except when the snow came early and the bottom rose wicked moisture up from the ground, or when the tarps held condensation against the wood, or when a wet autumn meant half your winter fuel supply was too damp to catch without kindling and patience and a lot of cursing. Marcus had lost count of how many mornings he'd knelt in front of his wood stove, feeding crumpled newspaper and bone-dry twigs into reluctant flames, waiting for marginally dry wood to finally commit to burning. This year he'd decided to try something different. He'd seen variations of it in old Scandinavian photos, read about it in a few backcountry forums during his rare trips to town for internet access. An off-ground wood rack, elevated, air underneath, air between the stacks, a simple roof to shed precipitation but allow wind to move through. The physics made sense to him. Wood dries through evaporation. Evaporation needs airflow. Ground contact holds moisture. Raise the wood, increase surface area exposed to moving air, reduce rot, speed drying time. Simple. The problem was that simple didn't mean accepted. He'd mentioned it to Tom Ferraro when Tom and his son stopped by with a cord of unsplit rounds in October. Tom was 61, third generation in these hills, and he looked at Marcus's sketches like they were written in Mandarin. "The hell is this? Some kind of pergola for your firewood? You planning to grow grapes on it?" His son laughed. Marcus explained the airflow principle, the ground moisture issue, the way elevation could reduce mold and speed seasoning. Tom just shook his head. "Been stacking wood on the ground since I was 6 years old. My father did it. His father did it. Never needed anything fancy. You overthink everything, Holt." Marcus let it go. He knew Tom's setup. Decent enough. Long rows against the north side of his barn, covered in blue tarps, functional for 20 years. But Marcus had also been there 2 winters ago when Tom ran out of properly dry wood in February and had to burn green splits that smoked more than they heated. Tom blamed a wet fall. Marcus saw a system problem. He started building on a cold morning in late October. The design was straightforward. 4x4 posts set 2 feet into the ground below the frost line, mixed with gravel and tamped down hard for drainage. He used pressure-treated lumber for the ground contact, untreated pine for the rest. 8-foot sections made sense for his workflow. Posts at each corner, crossbeams connecting them 18 inches off the ground, then a simple angled roof frame with corrugated metal roofing. The roof overhang extended past the wood stack by 8 inches on all sides to shed rain and snow while still allowing wind to pass underneath and through the gaps he'd leave between the stacked rows. The first section took him 3 days. Digging post holes in rocky soil was slow work. He hit granite 6 inches down on the northeast post and had to relocate it 3 feet south. The crossbeam joints needed to be tight because any wobble in the base structure would compound when loaded with half a cord of wood. He used galvanized carriage bolts, not nails, at every major connection point. Nails work loose under thermal expansion and contraction. Bolts don't. He'd learned that on a fence project 15 years ago. When he set the first load of split wood on the rack, the structure held without a creak. He stacked the rounds with deliberate gaps between each row, about 2 inches, enough for wind to penetrate but not so wide that the pile became unstable. The wood sat on thin cross slats, not directly on the base beams, creating even more airflow underneath. He covered the top with the corrugated roof panels angled to drain west, away from the prevailing wind. When he stepped back to look at it, the rack looked almost industrial. Clean lines, functional, empty space where most people expected solid mass touching the ground. Sarah Chen stopped by the following week. She lived 8 miles north, ran a small market garden in summer, trapped in winter. She was 36, sharp, practical, not prone to small talk. She looked at the rack for a long moment. "Huh," she said. "That's different." "Trying something new," Marcus said. "Theory is better airflow, faster drying." "Theory," she repeated, smiling slightly. "And if the theory's wrong, you spent how many hours building an art installation for firewood?" 3 days for the first section, getting faster on the others. She walked around it, examining the joints, the roof, the elevation. "I mean, it's well built. I'll give you that. But Marcus, we all just stack on pallets and tarp it. Has for generations. You really think this is going to make a difference worth the effort?" He shrugged. "Time will tell. Moisture meter says the wood I stacked 3 weeks ago has already dropped from 22% to 18%. Wood on my old ground piles is still at 21. "That's margin of error," she said. "Maybe. Or maybe it's airflow." She left, shaking her head, but not unkindly. Sarah was a skeptic by nature, but she respected effort. The others weren't as generous. Ray Kowalski showed up with his nephew 2 days later, ostensibly to borrow a splitting maul, really to see what Marcus was up to. Ray was loud, opinionated, successful in his own way. He ran a small logging operation, employed 4 guys, knew timber and tools, and how to make money in the woods. When he saw the racks, he laughed hard enough that his nephew looked embarrassed. "You building a stage for your firewood, Hollywood? Jesus Christ, Marcus. That's the most overcomplicated bullshit I've seen all year. You know what I do? I drop a couple pallets, stack the wood, throw a tarp over it, done. Takes me an hour. You spent what, a week on this?" 4 days for 3 sections, Marcus said evenly. "Holds about 2 cords total. And the wood's drying faster than anything I've had on the ground." "Drying faster," Ray repeated, making air quotes with his fingers. "You measure that with your feelings or with actual data?" "Moisture meter, checking every few days." Ray waved a hand dismissively. "Those things are garbage. You're telling me wood sitting up on some fancy rack is drying faster in November than wood that's been sitting since June? Come on." "The wood's the same age," Marcus said. "Split it all in September. Only difference is storage method." "Yeah, well, let me know how your science experiment works when it's January and you're burning through your supply trying to get wet wood to light." Ray grabbed the maul, told his nephew to stop staring, and left. Marcus heard them laughing as they drove down the access road. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not the mockery itself, but the assumption that anyone trying something different was automatically wrong, or showing off, or wasting time. Marcus didn't build the racks to prove anything to Ray or Tom or anyone else. He built them because the logic made sense and he was tired of fighting damp wood every morning. But when you live remote, your reputation is built on competence. People notice who runs out of firewood in February. They notice who has to burn green wood and whose chimney smokes black all day. They notice failure. So he kept checking. Every 3 days he'd pull a split round from the elevated racks and one from his remaining ground pile and check both with the moisture meter. The numbers didn't lie. The rack wood was consistently dropping faster. By mid-November, the rack-stored splits averaged 16% moisture. The ground pile was at 19%. 3% doesn't sound like much until you try to light a fire with 19% wood versus 16% wood. One catches with minimal kindling and burns clean. The other sulks and smolders and fills your cabin with smoke. He started documenting it. Not for anyone else, just for himself. A small notebook where he recorded dates, moisture readings, weather conditions. November 9th, rack wood, 15%, ground wood, 18%, overnight low 23 degrees, wind from northwest. November 14th, rack wood, 14%, ground wood, 17%, 2 inches of snow, temp dropped to 19. The pattern held. Every reading showed the same trend. Elevation and airflow were doing exactly what he'd thought they would. Tom came by again in late November with a load of stovepipe and some gossip from town. He looked at the racks, now all 4 sections completed and fully stacked, about 3 cords total. Still doing your woodworking project, huh? Still drying firewood 30% faster than ground storage, Marcus said, showing him the notebook. Tom flipped through the pages without much interest. You always were a record keeper. Me? I just burn what I cut, and if it smokes a little, so what? Gets the job done. Until you run out of dry wood in February. Tom's face hardened. That was 1 year. Wet fall. Everybody had problems. I had problems too, Marcus said. That's why I'm trying this. Yeah. Well, good luck with it. Tom didn't sound like he meant it. He left the pipe and drove off without his usual invitation to come by for coffee. December came in cold and stayed that way. The first real snow hit on the 4th, 8 inches overnight, temperature dropping to single digits. Marcus burned through half a rick that week, just keeping the cabin livable. But every piece of wood from the racks lit easily. No struggling. No smoke-filled cabin. No wasted kindling. He'd start with crumpled newspaper and pencil-thin twigs, add progressively larger splits from the rack, and within 10 minutes have a clean, hot fire drawing perfectly. The wood snapped and hissed as pockets of moisture turned to steam, but it was minimal, nothing like the wet hiss of ground-stored wood. Word got around. Sarah stopped by on her trapline route, checked the racks, asked about the moisture readings. She looked at his notebook, then at the clean burning fire in his stove, then back at the racks. Okay, she said. I'm paying attention now. This is actually working. Seems to be, Marcus said. Tom know about this? Tom thinks I'm wasting time. She laughed. Tom thinks everyone's wasting time, unless they're doing exactly what his grandfather did. But Sarah was practical. She asked about materials cost, build time, whether the roof was necessary or just helpful, how deep the posts needed to go. She took photos with her phone. I'm not saying I'm building one, she said, but I'm not saying it either. That should have been the end of it. Quiet validation. His system worked, a few people noticed, life goes on. But then Ray showed up again in mid-December with 4 of his logging crew guys and a case of beer. They'd been cutting timber in the north section all week and decided to stop by to see how Hollywood's Firewood Theater is performing. They were drunk enough to be loud, but not sloppy. Ray pointed at the racks. So seriously, Marcus, you're telling me this fancy setup is worth the time and money compared to just stacking on the ground like normal people? It's working for me, Marcus said carefully. He didn't want confrontation, but he also wasn't going to pretend the racks weren't effective. Working for you? Ray repeated. Okay, let's test that. You got some of this miracle wood handy? And some regular wood from before you went all carpenter on us? Marcus hesitated. He'd burned through most of his ground-stored wood first, trying to use the older, damper stuff while the new rack wood continued to dry. But he had a few splits left from the old pile, stored under a tarp near the woodshed. Yeah, I've got both. Great. Let's have a little demonstration. Light a fire with your ground wood, then light one with your rack wood. See if there's actually a difference or if you're just telling yourself a story. One of the crew guys, younger, maybe mid-20s, said, Come on, Ray. We don't need to. But Ray cut him off. No, I'm genuinely curious. Marcus here has been telling everyone his elevated racks are revolutionary. Let's see it. Marcus fetched 2 splits from each pile. The ground-stored pieces looked similar to the rack pieces, but they felt subtly different. Heavier. Denser. Less resonant when you knocked them together. He built 2 identical kindling setups in his fire pit outside. Newspaper base, twigs, small splits, 1 larger split on top of each. He lit both piles at the same time. The rack wood caught within 30 seconds. Clean flame, minimal smoke, the fire spreading quickly up through the kindling into the larger split. The ground wood smoldered. Smoke, yes, but no committed flame. Marcus added more kindling. The fire struggled, producing more smoke than heat. After 2 minutes, the rack pile was burning steadily, hot enough that you couldn't hold your hand 6 inches above it. The ground pile was still smoking, barely sustaining flame on the kindling layer, the larger split untouched. Ray's guys went quiet. Ray stared at both fires, his expression unreadable. "So the rack wood lights faster," he said finally. "Doesn't mean it's worth all that work. It means I don't waste time and fuel every morning fighting wet wood," Marcus said. "For me, that's worth it." Ray kicked some snow onto both fires, extinguishing them. "Yeah, well, I've been doing fine with my system for 20 years. Don't need to reinvent the wheel." He and his crew left. Nobody said much. Marcus cleaned up the fire pit and went inside, feeling oddly deflated. He'd proven his point, but it felt hollow. Ray wasn't going to change. Tom wasn't going to change. And honestly, Marcus didn't need them to. The racks worked. That was enough. Except the weather had other plans. The forecast that week called for a significant Arctic system pushing down from Canada. Radio said it would be the coldest stretch in a decade. Temperatures dropping below zero, sustained wind, potential for the kind of cold that finds every gap in your insulation, every weakness in your heating system. Marcus checked his wood supply. 3 cords stacked in the racks, all of it reading between 12 and 15% moisture. Optimal burning range. He felt prepared. The storm hit on December 18th. Temperature dropped from 28 degrees at noon to 6 degrees by midnight, then kept falling. By morning, it was -8, with a wind chill near -30. Marcus woke to frost on the inside of his windows and his breath visible in the cabin despite the wood stove running all night. He fed the fire with rack wood, 3 splits at once. They caught immediately, burned hot and clean, pushed the cabin temperature back up to 58 degrees within an hour. He went outside to check the racks, moving carefully on ice-slicked ground, wearing every layer he owned. The wind cut through the clearing like a blade. The racks stood solid, no movement even in sustained gusts. The roof panels had collected a thin layer of snow, but most had blown clear. The wood underneath remained dry, protected, but ventilated. Marcus pulled a split from the bottom row. Still dry, still solid, still reading 14% on the moisture meter even in sub-zero conditions. 3 miles away, Tom was having a different morning. Marcus didn't know this yet, but Tom's blue tarps had collected heavy snow, and the weight combined with wind had ripped 2 of them loose overnight. The exposed wood was now covered in blown snow and freezing moisture. Tom tried to start his stove with wood from the pile and got nothing but smoke. He dug deeper, found wood that was technically dry enough to burn, but barely. His cabin stayed cold. 43 degrees, 45 on a good day. His joints ached. His mood darkened. Ray's operation was worse. His main woodpile served not just his own cabin, but a bunkhouse where his crew stayed during intensive logging periods. He'd stacked everything on pallets months ago. Good wood, properly aged, covered with tarps. But December's repeated freeze-thaw cycles had created condensation under the tarps, and the ground moisture had wicked up through the pallets into the bottom rows. When the Arctic blast hit, Ray found himself with 2 cords of marginally burnable wood and 4 guys expecting heat. The fires worked eventually, but they were smoky, inefficient, requiring constant tending and excessive kindling. Ray burned through his kindling supply in 2 days and had to start splitting smaller and smaller feather sticks from larger pieces just to keep fires lit. On December 20th, Sarah drove her old pickup to Marcus's place, moving slowly on icy roads. She was wearing 3 coats and looked exhausted. "My cabin's 40 degrees, she said. "I can't get the wood to burn right. It's like everything got damp somehow, even under the tarp. Do you have any dry kindling you could spare? I'll pay for it, I just need—" She stopped when she saw his fire. Clean flames, minimal smoke, real heat radiating from the stove. "How are you getting it to burn like that?" she asked. "Rack wood," Marcus said. 12% moisture. Lights first try every time. She looked at him for a long moment. "I need to build one of those racks." "Spring would be better," Marcus said. "Ground's frozen now. Can't set posts properly." "I mean next year." But right now I need dry wood, or I'm going to freeze. He gave her a quarter cord from his racks, loaded her truck himself, wouldn't take payment. Just promise me you'll actually build a rack next fall, he said. I promise, she said. I was wrong. This system works. Word spread fast in small communities, especially when it's cold and people are desperate. Tom showed up 2 days later, proud look gone, replaced by something tired and practical. I heard you're selling dry wood, he said. I'm not selling, but I can give you some. Quarter cord enough? Tom nodded, standing awkwardly by the racks. How much of this do you have? About 2.5 cords left. Should get me through February easily. And it all lights like that? First try? Every piece. Tom watched Marcus load wood into his truck. I was wrong about the racks, he said finally. Thought you were overthinking it. Turns out you were just thinking. I had the same problems you're having now, Marcus said. Just got tired of fighting it. Could you show me how to build one? In the spring, I mean, when the ground thaws. Sure, it's not complicated. Just takes time and decent materials. Ray was the last holdout. His crew had been burning through wood at twice the normal rate because wet wood produces less heat and requires more fuel. They were going to run out before February. Marcus heard this from Sarah, who heard it from Tom, who heard it from Ray's nephew. Small-town information networks. Ray finally drove over on Christmas Eve, alone, no crew, no bravado. Just a tired man with a problem. I need to buy wood, he said. No preamble. I know you probably don't want to sell to me after I was an asshole about your racks, but I've got 4 guys depending on heat, and I'm not going to make it through winter at this rate. Marcus considered for a moment. He didn't need Ray's money, but he also understood desperation and the pragmatic need to set aside ego when survival was on the line. I'll give you half a cord, he said. No charge, but you'll need to pick it up yourself. And Ray, seriously, build some racks next year. This doesn't need to be a pride thing. I know, Ray said quietly. I was wrong. You were right. The system works. I'm not too proud to admit it. They loaded the wood together in silence. When Ray's truck was full, he paused before getting in. You going to tell everyone I came crawling back? No point, Marcus said. Everyone already knows the racks work. Ray nodded, started the truck, then stopped and rolled down the window. You ever want to sell those plans or whatever, the build specs? I know at least 6 guys who'd pay for them. It's not plans, Marcus said. It's just 4x4 posts, crossbeams, and a roof. Anyone can figure it out if they try. Yeah, but you did figure it out. That's worth something. After Ray left, Marcus stood in the clearing watching the sun set through the spruce trees. The temperature was already dropping again. Tonight would hit -12. But his cabin was warm, his wood stove was drawing clean, and he had enough dry fuel to last until March. The racks had proven themselves not through argument or demonstration, but through simple function during a crisis. When the weather turned serious and people needed heat that worked immediately, the elevated rack system with its superior airflow and moisture control had delivered exactly what it promised. Over the next 3 weeks, 7 people stopped by to look at the racks and ask questions. Marcus walked them through the design, explained the physics, showed them his moisture readings. Most took photos. A few took measurements. Tom brought over his son and nephew and spent 2 hours examining the joints and asking about materials. Sarah ordered lumber online and asked Marcus to help her build 2 sections in April when the ground thawed. Even Ray's nephew came by alone, sheepish, asking if Marcus would be willing to consult on a larger version for their crew bunkhouse. Marcus said yes to all of it, not because he wanted validation or credit, but because the system worked and there was no reason to gatekeep something that solved a common problem. Firewood storage is one of those fundamental challenges in backcountry life. You solve it or you suffer. Simple as that. By late January, the Arctic system had passed and temperatures moderated back to normal winter ranges, teens and 20s, manageable. Marcus's wood consumption had been remarkably efficient. The clean, burning rack wood required less fuel overall because it produced more heat per split and required minimal kindling. He estimated he'd saved at least a third of a cord compared to previous winters when he'd burned damp, ground-stored wood. That represented dozens of hours of splitting work and hauling time. Efficiency compounding across the season. Tom stopped by in early February with coffee and homemade bread, a peace offering of sorts. They sat in Marcus's cabin, the wood stove radiating steady heat, and talked about next season's plans. Tom wanted to build 4 sections, maybe 6, enough to get all his firewood off the ground. "I was talking to Ray," Tom said. "He's planning the same thing. Even bought a moisture meter after Christmas. First time in his life he's checked moisture content." "Desperation makes converts," Marcus said. "It's more than that," Tom said. "It's proof. You showed us something better and then the weather tested it for real. Hard to argue with results when it's 10 below and your fire won't light." They talked construction details. Tom had questions about post depth in his soil type, whether to use metal or shingle roofing, optimal dimensions for his splitting style. Marcus answered what he could and admitted where he was still learning. The racks worked, but they weren't perfect. He'd noticed that wood stacked too densely still dried slower than wood with proper gaps. He'd found that roof overhang mattered more than he'd initially thought. North-facing racks dried slower than south-facing ones, presumably due to sun exposure, small details that only emerged through observation and testing. "You going to write this down?" Tom asked. "Like a guide or something?" "Maybe," Marcus said. "I've got the notebook with all the moisture readings and observations. Could organize it into something useful." "You should. People would pay attention, especially after this winter." Marcus wasn't sure about that. He'd never been the type to seek attention or position himself as an expert. But he recognized that useful knowledge shared becomes more useful. If a simple elevated rack design could save people the frustration and inefficiency of damp firewood, why not document the process clearly? He spent the next few weeks refining his notes, sketching cleaner versions of the rack design, documenting the critical dimensions and materials choices that made the difference between a functional rack and an unstable waste of lumber. Post spacing mattered. Too wide, and the structure wobbled under load. Too narrow, and you wasted materials. He settled on 8-foot sections as optimal for one person to build and manage. Roof pitch needed to be at least 15 degrees to shed snow effectively, but not so steep that it caught wind and created structural stress. The gap between the ground and the first level of wood needed to be at least 16 inches to prevent ground moisture and snow accumulation from affecting the lowest row. By March, he had something resembling a guide. Not fancy, just clear descriptions and measurements and observations about what worked and what didn't. Sarah looked at it and said it was exactly what people needed. No nonsense, just practical information. That's valuable. He posted it online in a few relevant forums, expecting maybe a dozen views and some polite comments. Instead, it got shared widely. People in Montana, Wyoming, Maine, Alaska, anywhere that dealt with cold winters and firewood storage. The comments ranged from grateful to skeptical to argumentative, which was fine. Marcus wasn't trying to convert everyone, just offering information for those interested. Some people would stick with ground storage because it worked well enough for them and they saw no reason to change. Others would experiment with variations on the elevated rack concept. That was the nature of practical knowledge. It spread through demonstration and adaptation, not through dogma. What surprised him most was the message from a university forestry extension agent who'd seen the plans and wanted to do a formal study on comparative drying rates between ground storage and elevated rack storage. They offered to pay Marcus as a consultant and use his racks as one of the test sites. He agreed, curious what more rigorous measurement would show. The study ran for 18 months and confirmed what Marcus's handheld moisture meter and personal observations had already indicated. Elevated storage with adequate airflow and weather protection reduced drying time by approximately 28 to 33%, depending on wood species and seasonal humidity levels. The paper was published in an obscure forestry journal and quietly cited in a few extension service guides. Marcus got a check for $800 and a co-author credit he didn't really need but appreciated anyway. By the following November, Sarah had her racks built, 2 sections that held about a cord and a half. Tom had 4 sections. Ray had built 6, including an extended version for the crew bunkhouse. A dozen other people in the wider community had adopted some version of the design. The county extension office added elevated rack plans to their homesteading resource library. It became normal, which was exactly what Marcus wanted. Not revolutionary, just effective. A solved problem. He stood in his clearing that next November, watching the first snow of the season drift down through gray light, and felt the particular satisfaction that comes from improving a system that needed improving. The racks would need maintenance eventually. Some roof panels might need replacing in a few years. Posts would need checking for rot or frost heave. But the core design was sound, proven through a brutal testing winter, and adopted by people who'd initially rejected it. That was the trajectory of good ideas: resistance, testing, grudging acceptance, eventual normality. The fire in his cabin burned clean and hot, fed by wood that had spent the summer and fall elevated and ventilated, protected but breathing, drying thoroughly and evenly. No smoke, no struggle, just reliable heat when the cold came down, and staying warm mattered more than pride or tradition or the way things had always been done. Sometimes the best solutions are simple adjustments to known methods, small improvements that compound into significant advantages over time. Raise the wood 18 inches. Add airflow underneath. Protect from direct precipitation, but allow wind to pass through. 3 changes that reduced moisture content by 30% and turned every fire into a first-try success. That winter passed easier than most. Marcus burned less wood, spent less time fighting damp splits, maintained better heat with less effort. When February came and other years he'd been rationing fuel and hoping his supply lasted until the spring thaw, he had a comfortable surplus. More than enough. He gave away another half-cord to a young couple who'd moved into an old homestead up the valley, and were learning the hard way that romanticizing backcountry life was very different from successfully living it. They asked about the racks. He showed them. They built their own version in April, grateful for the knowledge and the head start before the next winter arrived. Knowledge moves like that in practical communities. Someone solves a problem, others see it works. The solution spreads, becomes normal, gets improved by other people's observations and adaptations. Marcus's basic design spawned variations. Someone in the valley added wheels to make sections portable. Another person experimented with adjustable roof angles to optimize snow shedding versus sun exposure. A retired carpenter built an elaborate version with multiple tiers and integrated tool storage. None of it was wrong. All of it was people engaging with a functional idea and making it work for their specific needs and context. What Marcus appreciated most was the shift from mockery to curiosity. Ray stopped by occasionally, not to borrow tools or make jokes, but to actually talk about what was working and what could be improved. Tom brought over venison stew, and they'd spend evenings discussing building techniques and wood species characteristics, and whether a purely south-facing orientation was worth the extra effort when laying out a new rack system. Sarah showed him photos from online forums where people in Ontario and Montana and Vermont were building versions of the racks and reporting similar moisture reduction results. The university extension agent sent him copies of the published study and asked if he'd be willing to present at a regional forestry conference. He declined the conference but felt good about the study being published. Information preserved and distributed to people who could use it. The third winter with the racks was almost boring. No drama, no wet wood struggles, no running short on supply. Just clean fires, efficient heating, adequate fuel lasting through March with surplus to spare. Boring is underrated in backcountry living. Boring means systems are working, problems are solved. You can focus on other things instead of constantly troubleshooting basic survival needs. Marcus spent that winter working on other projects, restoring an old chainsaw, building a proper tool shed, experimenting with improved insulation techniques for the cabin's north wall, projects he'd postponed in previous years because managing firewood consumed so much time and mental energy. By spring, he'd been living with the elevated rack system for 3 full seasons. The initial 4 sections had weathered well. Some minor repairs needed, a few loose bolts retightened, one roof panel replaced after a branch fell during a windstorm. But the structures remained solid and functional. The wood stored in them continued to dry faster and burn cleaner than anything he'd stored on the ground. The numbers stayed consistent. Rack wood averaged 13 to 15% moisture by burning season. Ground-stored wood, when he tested it at other people's places or from his old stockpile, consistently ran 18 to 21%, 3 to 6 percentage points difference, the margin between easy fires and difficult ones. People still asked him about it. A young couple from town drove out to see the racks before building their own off-grid cabin. A wildfire crew supervisor asked about using the design for their remote camps. A magazine writer wanted to do a story about practical backcountry innovations. Marcus mostly declined interviews but was happy to show the racks to anyone who asked. The design was public information. No patents, no proprietary secrets, just functional carpentry and basic physics applied to an old problem. What he'd learned through the process extended beyond firewood storage. The experience reinforced something he'd always believed but sometimes forgot. Tradition has value and history matters, but neither should be immune to testing and improvement. The old ways worked well enough to get people through many winters, but well enough isn't the same as optimal. Sometimes the best next step is taking what works and asking how it could work better, then being willing to build something different and test it honestly, even when people laugh or dismiss the effort. The mockery had stung initially. Not going to lie about that. When Ray and Tom and others treated the elevated racks as some kind of pretentious, overcomplicated joke, Marcus questioned whether he was actually onto something or just wasting time on unnecessary complexity. The moisture meter data helped, giving him objective measurements to counter subjective opinions. But the real validation came from the crisis winter. When temperatures dropped to dangerous levels and people needed fires that worked immediately without struggle, the rack wood delivered while ground-stored wood failed. Crisis testing is honest testing. It strips away ego and opinion and reveals what actually functions under pressure. Marcus thought about this while splitting wood the following fall, a steady rhythm of maul strikes and split rounds stacking up in neat piles destined for the racks. Every piece would be elevated, ventilated, protected, but not sealed, given optimal conditions to release moisture and become ideal fuel. He wasn't splitting wood to prove anything anymore. That phase had passed. Now he was just maintaining a system that worked, repeating a process that delivered reliable results, living in the particular satisfaction that comes from problems solved and systems optimized. If there was a broader lesson beyond firewood storage, it was probably this. Small improvements to fundamental systems compound over time into significant advantages. Raising wood 18 inches off the ground doesn't sound revolutionary. It sounds obvious or trivial or not worth the effort. Until you measure the results over months and winters and realize you're burning 30% less fuel for the same heat, spending far less time fighting damp wood, maintaining better living conditions with less effort. Those small margins matter. They're the difference between just getting by and actually thriving, between resenting the daily challenges of backcountry life and embracing them because you've got the systems dialed in enough that basic survival doesn't consume all your energy. The racks stood in his clearing like practical sculptures, functional art built from dimensional lumber and galvanized fasteners, and the willingness to try something different despite social pressure to conform. They'd hold another 2 cords before winter came on. That wood would dry through October and November, shedding moisture to the wind, reaching optimal burning condition by December. When the cold arrived, Marcus would have clean burning fuel that lit on the first match every single time. No smoke, no struggle, no wasted kindling or frustration. Just reliable heat from a system that worked because it was designed according to physical principles and tested through experience and improved through observation. That's really the core of it. Design based on principles. Test through experience. Improve through observation. Repeat. Apply that process to anything, firewood or otherwise, and you'll solve problems that other people accept as unsolvable, simply because that's how it's always been. Maybe your solution won't be revolutionary. Maybe it'll just be 18 inches of elevation and better airflow. But if it works 30% better than the old way, that's worth building. That's worth defending through the mockery phase. That's worth sharing once the crisis proves what you already knew from data and observation. Marcus finished splitting the last round, stacked it on the rack, and headed inside as twilight turned the clearing blue and cold. Tomorrow would bring more splitting, more stacking, the ongoing work of preparing for winter. But it was good work now. Efficient work. Work that produced exactly the results he needed without waste or unnecessary struggle. The racks had changed that. A simple structure elevated above the ground, allowing air to flow, wood to breathe, moisture to leave. Physics applied. Problem solved. If you're living somewhere cold and burning wood to stay warm, maybe you're dealing with the same issues Marcus faced. Damp wood that won't light, smoky fires that produce more frustration than heat, feeling like you're burning through supply too fast because wet wood is half as efficient as dry wood. The elevated rack system might be worth considering. It's not complicated. It doesn't require special tools or rare materials. Just posts set below frost line, cross beams creating elevation, adequate airflow underneath and between stacks, a simple roof to shed precipitation while allowing wind through. Build it right and the wood will dry faster. Light easier. Burn cleaner. Save you time and fuel and frustration across the entire winter. That's the practical takeaway. But there's also a deeper one about trusting your own observations and being willing to try solutions that others dismiss. Innovation doesn't always look revolutionary. Sometimes it's just raising the wood 18 inches and measuring the results. Small changes, significant improvements, proven through testing and refined through experience. If you've got a system that works well enough, maybe that's fine. But if you're fighting it every winter, maybe it's worth asking whether well enough is actually good enough, and whether a few days of building effort could save you months of daily struggle. The fire burns clean tonight. First match, minimal kindling, hot and steady within minutes. Outside, 3 cords of wood sit elevated and drying under angled metal roofs, preparing for the cold months ahead. Inside, heat radiates from proven fuel and tested systems. Tomorrow brings more of the same, and the day after that, and the long winter beyond. But it's manageable now. Not because the winters got easier, but because the system got better. That's worth something. That's worth building. That's worth sharing with anyone willing to try something different and test whether the old way is the best way or just the familiar way. If you found this story valuable and want to hear more about practical solutions to backcountry challenges, real-world testing of traditional methods, and honest accounts of what works versus what's just repeated without question, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, more problems solved through observation and testing, more systems improved by people willing to question tradition without disrespecting it. Hit that subscribe button and you'll be the first to know when the next story drops. Until then, stack your wood high, keep it dry, and question everything that doesn't make sense, even if everyone around you says that's just how it's done.